So there are at least two styles of question 4. This first style is about giving you a specification and a flowchart and building the code from scratch, essentially. So you're going to be given more or less a blank Python file. The thing you need to worry about with these ones, or focus on with these ones, is to make sure that you clearly think your way through the different elements. It will have possibly some selection and some repetition in it. It will definitely have some input and output. You also need to think about your layout, proper variable naming, using comments, white space, just to give yourself as much of a chance of getting those marks as possible. Critical to all of this is the idea of decomposition, so taking the problem and breaking it down into different bits. What do I need to get it to do next? What do I need to get it to do last? Critical to all of this is breaking your problem down using decomposition, thinking about what the different aspects of the problem are, and trying to create different parts of the program as you go along to solve different problems. So what we've got in front of us is our Q4 code. We've also got our flowchart and we've got our specification, and what we need to do is, between the specification and the flowchart, work out what we need and work out how we can solve this problem. You're going to get marks here for functionality. We could get marks here for making the problem. So you're going to get marks here for functionality. You're going to get marks for deconstructing the problem, working out what the different elements of the problem are. Now, it's a really good idea to try and follow these flowchart really slowly. Think about what's happening, think about what the different elements of the flowchart are trying to do, but also bear in mind the specification and what the specification is saying, particularly when it comes to the data that is being used, or perhaps any validation that's in there. So this program calculates the this program finds the minimum and maximum numbers entered by a user. The numbers are positive real numbers, greater than 1,000 and less than 9,000, and it works out the mean of all the numbers as well. So we know that we've got to find the minimum and the maximum. We've got to allow the user to enter real numbers between 1,000 and 9,000, and we also need to find the mean. So we've got a few things in there which already tell us the sorts of things that we might need in there. If you look at the flowchart, start and an end, so we can see where the thing starts and stops. We've also got the boxes. Now, these rectangles are essentially going to be any kind of process, like creating variables or calculating something. The parallelograms here are for input and output. And you also have these diamonds, sometimes called decision diamonds, and they indicate two things. So the first thing they might indicate would be an if statement. So if the count is less than 0, do that. But they could also indicate a while loop. And if we look at this quite carefully, what we can see is that we check if the count is greater than 0, then we seem to go through a whole load of other processes and a few decision diamonds. But then if you look at that arrow, this line, it's following this line all the way back, so it's actually a loop. So this isn't just an if, it's a loop. So a decision diamond can either be a loop, in which case it's got to be the while statement, or it can be an if statement, which is what these things seem to look like. Is the new value bigger than maximum? If it's so, set the maximum. So let's see if we can work out what this is, what's going on. So let's start off with our creating variables. So it has told us where to put those variables, where to create them. I'm just going to So let's start by creating our variables, and each time we create a variable we're going to try and work out what we need it for and where it's used in the program. So we're not only just going to create them, we're going to sort of look forward for them. So we're going to start off with creating a variable for count. So it looks like count is being set to something called the number of values. So it looks like we're getting the number of values. So count is being set to that, and it's checking if it's bigger than 0. And down here it's reducing it. So what I'm trying to do is find all those places where count is being used. And it looks like it's being used on the set count, it's being used on the while loop, and it's being used on the reduce count. Now that tells me that probably count is going to be an integer, so I'm just going to set that up here. And I'm also going to put in a comment. So initialize count integer to 0. The other thing we've got is number of values. Now that gets asked by the user, so it's going to ask it for how many values it wants. Now let's have a look and see where it's being used. Gets the number of values, sets that to the number of values. Doesn't appear to be using it anywhere else, but I know I've got to create a mean. And what we do know is that to calculate a mean is the total of all the data that's been entered divided by the number of values that are entered. So actually this must also be a integer. I'm going to use camel case here. If you really want to tidy it up, you can do what I'm doing, which is just playing around with the formatting to make it a bit prettier. Also makes it much clearer. We've now got the value inputted, so this is referring us to actually entering the data, and where that gets done, it looks like it's happening here, and the numbers are positive real numbers greater than 1,000 and less than 9,000. So looks like these are reals. So in order to tell it that, what I need to do is to also do the same thing here, but because it's a float, I've got to go 0.0. So just bear in mind that real numbers and floats in this case are the same thing. So initialize value input float to 0.0. Again, I'm just tidying up a little bit after myself. I've now got the total, and the total looks like gets a value, adjusts the total, so it must be adding it to the total. It must be, because we're working out the mean, we need the whole total in order to divide it by the number of values. So our total, well, we're adding up a whole load of floats, so our total must be a float as well. Okay. And we've got a maximum and then a minimum and then a mean, and because these are because these are floats, we also need to initialize them, but we know something about the minimum and the maximum. The minimum is greater than 1,000 and less than 9,000, so we want to set the minimum as a starting point, perhaps to 1,000.1. and then we've got the maximum, and this one, it's not telling me how many decimal places, but as long as I give it a reasonable guess, there we go. That also sets that up, so initialize maximum to 899.9. And then we also need the mean, and the mean has also got to be a float. So that's my variables created. And now what I can do is start to get into this program. And what you're going to see me do is lay the program out with commenting, try to maximize my marks in terms of the way I've designed the code, in the way I have deconstructed it and taken it apart. So try and get those design marks, those layout marks, those decomposition marks as high as I can. So let's start off with getting the number of values. So I need to get that in. And one other thing is you're going to get marks for how clear your messages are. It hasn't told me exactly what the messages are here, so I can be a bit more flexible with that. So get the number of values, so no of values. Be a bit careful here, it's dead easy to use uppercase, lowercase, get them mixed up a little bit. If you need to, you can copy and paste your variable names. That's also not a bad technique. I need to store it as a float because that's the data type I'm using. Notice I'm creating some white space all around things, so enter the number of values. Okay, so if I want to be really careful, I can put a comment in there. Ensure user input is converted from a string to a float. That's important that we do that. And now we're going to set the count to the number of values. So count is going to be the number of values. Notice I've put a bit of spacing around here just to help it. We now get into is count greater than 0, and this looks like it's a loop, and the reason, again, to remind you, is when you look at it, it has this arrow going back upon itself. So let's see if we can work that out as a bit of a comment. So create a while loop to read in the values, work out max and min. Okay, so let's see if we can do that. So while, I tend to prefer to put these in brackets because it's a bit easy, a bit clearer. While count is greater than 0, don't forget your colon here. We now need to get a value from the user, so let's put a little bit of spacing out there, and we need to get a value. That value, because it's a floating point number, has got the same issue as before, so ensure value is converted to a float, and so the value input is equal to float input, enter a value. Okay. We now get into something which says adjust the total. Well, what does it mean by that? Well, in the end, I've got to create this mean, so I need to add up the numbers as I go along to work out what the mean is, because I need to go total divided by the number of values. So let's see if we can go work this out. So again, I'm going to put a comment in. So adjust the total. So total becomes total, and we're going to add on the new value. The next thing looks like we've got to do is we seem to get into these two decision diamonds. Is the new value bigger than the maximum? If it is, set the maximum. Is the value less than the minimum? If it is, set the minimum. So these don't loop back on themselves, so it must be the if statement. So selection statements to work out maximum and minimum. So let's do that. So if our new value, well, our new value, it's referring to value input. If that's bigger than the maximum, don't forget your colon again. So this is our yes condition. So this is over here. Set the new maximum. Well, if it's if the thing we've entered is bigger than the maximum, this must be our new maximum. So our maximum must be equal to value input. Something very similar here. If the value input is smaller than the minimum, then our minimum must be equal to, or must have in it stored, value input. We now have to reduce the count. Now what's happening here is that if I put 5 numbers in it, so I said count was, number of values was 5, it sets count to 5, is count greater than 0. So it looks like what it's doing is it's going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. It's going to stop there because 0 isn't bigger than 0. So it looks like it's reducing that every single time. So it must be reducing it by 1. So let's just put that in. So reduce count by 1. So count becomes count minus 1. Notice, if I just have a quick look back at the spacing, I've spaced out different elements of the program with a bit of white space, bit of blank lines in between. I've made sure that everything is neatly spaced so it's not all squished up, so that I get those marks for layout, for design, as quickly as I can. Okay, so that's the end of the while loop. Now be very careful here. In order to know that it's the end of the while loop, you pull back here. Okay. If you are really worried about that, then you can say end of while loop. So you can do that if you want to. That just helps you indicate where things are. But you need to now be not here, but at the beginning of the line. Let's give ourselves a bit more space. It now asks me to, so I've come through that, it now goes on to this no, so it's stop the loop, calculate the mean, and do the outputs. So I'm actually going to write in the formula just to make life a bit easier. So the mean is equal to the total number of values divided by the number of values. So it's equal to that. Be careful not to use count here, because count here is now 0. But number of values has kept how many values we have. So that's the reason for using count, so you don't lose track of how many numbers you've actually entered. So that's nice and easy to do. So mean is total divided by no of values. I probably didn't need a comment, but that's okay. And our last bit here is output minimum maximum and mean. And I'm going to do those in separate things. Lots of ways you can do this, but I'm going to use the simplest. If you're worried about white space, you can do that. I can copy and paste those lines. So if if I need to, because I know these are fairly similar. And here I've got my mean. And that's actually my program done. I'm going to do one final thing. I'm just going to tidy up that comment and change that comment to calculate mean, just to make it really easy, make it really obvious what's going on. And that's how you solve this problem. Just make sure you save it, we can test it, we can run it, and make sure that everything's working as it should.